Welcome everyone to the University of Ghana, and I will be your this session. Now, during this session, we will listen to 3 presentations, and after each of the presentations are completed, we will have each paper's discussant provide minutes, after more for about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A as time permits. Now, during the video presentations, attendees can feel free to submit questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you can raise your hand during the Q&A session and pose your questions vocally. Now, at this point, we can begin with the video presentations for this session. We are going to listen to the presentation by Henry Bello Ficker, and he's from the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Regional Development in Cameroon. His paper is titled "The Socio-Economic, Cultural and Demographic Factors of Gap Between Urban and Rural Areas in Terms of Early Childhood Development and Empirical Evidence from Cameroon using the Fairly Decomposition Model." Can we have the video, please?
Hello, discussants, ladies and gentlemen. The paper I am going to present is a result of a research jointly carried out by me, Bello Ficker Henry, Teno Suleiman Bari, and Jambunumini Maxime. Before I continue, I would like to implore your indulgence because I'm a French speaker, so my English is still improving. My presentation is as follows. Next slide. Okay. We have an introduction, a methodology, results and discussion, and policy implication. Okay. The economic development of a country cannot be achieved without a well-educated, physically healthy, psychologically balanced, and socially well-integrated working population. Several studies have shown that the acquisition of these strong productive characteristics depends a lot on the quality of an individual during his early childhood. For that reason, UNICEF 2015 states that sustainable development begins with healthy and well-educated children. Next slide. In Cameroon, among population made up of children aged between 36 and 59 months, 68% living in urban areas are in a good development process, against 56.5% in the rural area. Next slide. Considering this gap, and given that the inclusive early children development is an important condition for a country's long-run economic growth, we found it important to ask the following question. What are the explanatory factors for this observed gap between urban and rural areas in terms of early childhood development in Cameroon? So our main objective is to identify the factors which explain the gap between urban and rural areas in terms of early childhood development in Cameroon. Next slide. Our dependent variable is the differential between urban and rural areas of probability for a child to be in a good development process. Our underlying variable is the young child's development index. This index is constructed by considering 4 dimensions. There are reading and calculation, physical health, social-emotional framework, and ability to learn. Next slide. Our explanatory variables are resident area, urban and rural, region of the household health, educational level of the mother of the child sex and age group, and the diet. And we also have the child's social environment, which is captured by variables like the variables relating to educational and fun activities carried out with a parent or other adults, such as reading, walks, tales, songs, drawings, and other educational games, and existing of an educational program. Next slide. The data we used are those collected during the 5th multiple index cluster survey carried out by the National Institute of Statistics of Cameroon in 2014, and the sample consists with 2,815 children aged between 36 and 59 months. Next slide. Our models, or the model we use to achieve our objective is the fairly decomposition model. The term A is the endowment effect. It is the explained part of the gap between urban and rural children. And the term B is the unexplained part of the gap. Next slide. It should be noted that the fairly decomposition model is an extension of the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition method to the explanation of probability differentials between obtained using nonlinear distribution functions, such as logistic functions, as the case of the study. It should be also noted that the results of the fairly decomposition method are very sensitive to the order of inclusion of the explanatory variables in the basic model. So to solve this problem, we use the randomization, which is an iterative process. This method is more used as solution for this problem. Okay. Globally, the decomposition model of Fairley shows that the gap between urban and rural children in terms of early childhood development is explained by 48.33%, explained by the differential of the distribution of characteristics between the children, between urban and rural areas. And you can also see that the detailed decomposition results reveals that there are 5 explanatory variables of the observed gap between urban and rural areas in terms of early childhood development. These are having more than 2 books. That's the first factor. The second factor is following an educational program. And then we have living in East Center South area. The fourth factor is counting, spelling, and drawing with a parent or older adults. And the last factor is living in a medium living standard household. In view of these results, we can notice that globally, the factors that contribute most to the explanation of the gap between urban and rural areas in terms of early childhood development are socio-educational. These factors contribute to the socio-cognitive development of the child. Next slide. From the literature review, we can see that there are three main channels by which the social environment influences the socio-cognitive development of the child. And we have the first channel, which is speaking channel. The speaking channel has been developed by Hart and Wesley, 1995, Rubenstein and House, 1982, Carroll, 1980, and Golden and Anderson in 1969. This is the first channel. The second channel is the reading channel, which has been developed by Wen and Hebert in 1988, Mason and Allen in 1986. And the third channel is the socio-emotional channel, which has been developed by Sopkin et al. 2016, Leadbeat, Bishop and River, 1996, Kristen Senna in 2014, Franz Chetty and Ed, 2014, and Wafa in a thesis in 2017. Next slide. In the light of this result, we think that without neglecting the living standard of the household and the socio-cultural factors, it would be optimal for the policymakers to emphasize more their actions on facilitating for both urban and rural areas, and this access and the access on the child's improvement cognitive capabilities facility. So that is the principal implication for policymakers that are made. And next slide. These are the main points we wanted to share with you in this presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Henry. We'll now listen to the second video presentation. This is by Elise Wang Sun from Maastricht University, and her paper is titled The Forgotten Hosts, First and Second Generation Impacts of IDP's Inflow on Children's Early Childhood Development, Evidence from Burundi. We can have the video presentation now.
Today, I will be presenting my work entitled The Forgotten Hosts, First and Second Generation Impact of IDP Inflow on Children Early Childhood Development in Host Community in Burundi. I'm Swazik Elise Wangsone. I'm a young professional in the Social Development Global Practice of the World Bank, and I'm also a PhD fellow at the United Nations University in Maastricht. So why do we care about the impact that IDP might have on host communities? So over the past decade, the number of people living in forced displacement situation has significantly increased, reaching a staggering number of almost 71 million in 2019, out of which about 40% of them are displaced within their own country, meaning that these are actually internally displaced people. And the forced displacement crisis is concentrated in developing countries, with 99% of IDP living there. So basically, even in the short term, quantifying the impact of IDPs on hosts has been sparse and quite challenging in the growing literature of the microeconomic consequence of forced displacement. If we look at the report from the International Displacement Center, and unlike refugees, IDP can generate positive or negative socioeconomic impact on their host by driving the demands of prices, like the demand of goods and services in the area where they are coming. But they can also have a negative impact by perhaps increasing criminality, as some studies have shown, also triggering competition over housing and access to resources and key services such as health, education, and also access to the labor market. So there is this long-standing debate whether refugees or IDP are considered as a burden or a driver for positive change for their host communities. And there's a systematic review that was undertaken on 56 papers that find that the probability of finding a negative and significant impact on household well-being among the host population is less than 20%. And but there is more research needs to be done beyond the short term to look at how the inflow of IDPs can have an impact on the host community on the long run. So there is this emerging literature on the intergenerational impact of shocks such as famine, pollution, natural disaster, pandemic, and human capital. And there's also at the same time a sizable literature on lifelong developmental and socioeconomic consequences of early life shocks. So built on those facts, so the fact that there is few research that look at the impact of forcibly displaced on the host community, but at the same time, building on the literature that have shown the impact of early life shocks, like shock that happened when the child is unborn or when the parent were actually still having the baby on the fetus. How does that impact on the long run on the children, on various outcomes on the children, especially on health and learning outcome? So our paper contribute to those literature. So we look at the literature on the long-term or intergenerational persistent effect of temporary population shocks on health and learning outcome, but also the literature on the long-term impact of forced migration flows on health and learning outcome of host children, which is barely addressed in the literature. So much specifically, in this paper, we are looking at whether children who are born from mothers that are living in district, in high IDP receiving district, are more likely to be stunting 2 decades later, or whether they are more likely to present lower learning ability than their peers. We are also looking at under what condition, how and why do mothers' sudden exposure to IDP at different stage of their life course impact on their offspring health and cognitive development. So this is the graph of IDP in Burundi. You will see the sharp increase of the number of IDP in the country between 1995 and 1999. And this is where we are basing our, we call it a temporal variation or geographical variation of IDP inflow on children that were born almost 20 years after the IDP came into certain area in Burundi. So which data are we using? We are using data on IDP sites and their population per commune. They are coming from the 2003 UNFPA Burundi report on IDP. We focus on 127 districts, 13,000 under 5 years old children, 554 cluster. And what we use here is the regroupment policy, which was abandoned in 1997 but revamped in 1999. To be able to agree on the period where IDP came into the area. So we are also having in our possession the fourth and latest Burundi DHS data. With key feature, you have the GPS location of the cluster, the migration history of mothers and father, meaning the year they move into the current area of residence or whether they've always lived there. We also have health anthropometrics that we use as our main outcome of interest. And we also know about mothers and fathers' participation to the labor market, so the Wealth Index educational level. So here, one of the key information that we are taking from the Burundi DHS that help us to actually know whether the parent that we have on the data set who are living in those areas is the migration history, because we know at which year they move into the current area where they live in the 2016 Burundi data. So in terms of data description, this is how the UNFPA 2003 report gives us the population per IDP camp and per year of arrival. So we know, as I said, that the regroupment policy was actually abandoned after 1997. So we know how many IDP were living in which provinces and which districts at that time. So we are taking that from this report. And so basically here we are computing the various measures of IDP influx. Since we don't have information on the GPS location of the IDP camps, we are only looking at the population of the IDP in a specific district, and we are also looking at the weight, like how much those IDP were as compared to the provinces. So here I'm only showing how the computation is done. So in terms of the methodology that we are using, so first of all, we are mapping the number of IDP camp per district. I mean, we don't have the GPS location of the camps, but what we have is the DHS cluster. So we can see exactly where the household in 2016, 2017 are located. And at the same time, and then based on that, we will use a diff in diff, basically by combining a spatial and geographical variation of the presence of IDPs using the DHS data, the 2016, 2017 DHS data. And we also have a time variation where we look at the age of the mother at the time of the influx to create additional variation. So we are not only looking at how much IDP were living in those areas at the time, but we are also looking at the age of the parent at the time the IDP came into the area. And we are doing the same analysis as a sensitivity checks in IDP-free district to see whether our result hold. And we also look at potential mechanism because we basically we acknowledge the fact that 20 years is a lot. So many things might have happened. So we look at how do we believe that the fact that some parents were living in high IDP receiving district, how could that affect children's health outcome and educational and learning ability? So this is the map of the DHS cluster in Burundi. And so the empirical strategy is based, as I said it, so we use just child year of birth fixed effect, mother year of birth fixed effects, district fixed effect, and then we have a various outcome of interest, as I said, learning ability. And this is the diff in diff where here we are basically interacting the geographical and the time variation. So what did we find? So here we find that for mothers that were between 13 and 16, when IDP came in Burundi in 1996, 1997, their children have a lower, they are less likely to be stunted and they are more likely to be stunted, and they have a lower height for age Z score, which is the anthropometric indicator to know whether a child is stunted or no. And then in terms of learning outcome, what we found no significant impact on the same mother that were between 13 and 16, but we do find that for the mother that were still in utero at that time, the children are more likely to follow simple instruction, they are more likely to take tasks independently, and they are less likely to be violent, so to buy or quick other child. So meaning that those mothers that were still in their mother womb when the IDP came were less exposed as compared to the other mother, even when we look at the magnitude. So here we then look at the mechanism. So we look at the height of the mother, the years of education of the mother, the wealth index of the mother. And what we found that is here that when we consider the 13 to 16 and the in utero, we do find here that, again, so remember, we found that those mothers that were here, they were more likely to have their children that are stunting, and then they were also more likely to have their children that have a lower hypho-HZ score, which is the same. So here we find that the mechanism through which this might have played out is that those mothers have less years of education, and also they are less likely to be living into a specific income bracket, meaning that they are poorer as compared to the other mother that were still very young. So in their adolescence, they were really impacted by the influx of IDP. So so here, this is the same table, just that I'm trying to highlight other like the mechanism that we saw from learning ability, and we see that there is nothing that happened for mother in utero, basically, because as we found, they were less impacted in terms of learning ability for their children. So in terms of conclusion, so what we can say is that children that are born 20 years later from mother who were 13 to 16 at the time of the high IDP influx are more likely to be stunting as compared to those who were already adult at the time. And children born 20 years later from mother who were in utero at the time of the IDP influx have better learning outcome as compared to adults. And in terms of policy recommendation, humanitarian organizations have to double their efforts to better support IDP and their hosts, at least for those staying calm in the time of crisis, with a focus on those in their late childhood. So in terms of way forward, we're planning to run an heterogeneity analysis by gender, looking at fathers and mothers. So what we presented here are only results for mothers, so we want to go to do it for father as well. We're also planning, since we have a large enough sample and we won't have issue of power, to do another heterogeneity analysis where we break up our analysis by gender of the child, looking at the girl child and the boy child. Also the heterogeneity of impact, considering pre-existing socioeconomic condition in host community prior to the arrival of IDP. We still need to get those data. We're also trying to sharpen our analysis by computing the IDP presence index, which will be consider as the weighted sum of the inverted distance of each cluster to the 230 geocoded IDP, and perform the analysis using information on IDP count and their population at the sub-colony level rather than the commune level, to have a much more fine-grained estimation. So we have a couple of questions for the audience. The first is, should we expect a difference between IDP impact and refugee impact on host community in terms of children health and education outcome? If yes, in which direction? The second is, any clue on where to get geocoded localization of our IDP site to fine-tune our estimation strategy by computing an IDP influx index? We are still trying to get a hold of those data. And what is the best way to define the treatment group here? Like, should we consider treated mother as those who were under 5 years or over, or should we just leave it the way we did it? And then the last question that we also have here is to, like, for the audience, we have the population by sex. So we just don't have the overall size of the population, but we know how many men and how many women move. And we are just wondering whether it would make sense for us to consider such additional information in this analysis. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your question.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Elise. And now we're going to listen to the third video presentation in this session. This is going to be given by Sean Sylvia, and he is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His paper is titled Parental Migration and Early Childhood Development in Rural China. We can have the video now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Sylvia. I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Department of Health Policy and Management. So today I'm looking forward to sharing some research that colleagues and I have done looking at the impact of parental migration on early childhood outcomes in rural China. Let me share my slides here. All right, so my co-authors on this study are Iusb at Shanxi Normal University, Yu Bai, also at Shanxi Normal, and Yao Zhongshi, also at Shanxi Normal, Renfu Luo at Peking University, Scott Roselle, and Alexis Medina at Stanford. So here are kind of the motivating set of facts for our study. So rural to urban migration in China over the past few decades constitutes what's the largest movement in people in human history. So official statistics put the number of rural migrant workers in China at about 291 million in 2019. Or that's more than a third of China's workforce. So many of these migrants are parents who, due to a number of factors, have to leave their children at home in rural areas in the care of other family members. So based on a 1% census carried out in 2015, there were about 41 million of these left behind children, which is shown in the dark purple here on this graph. Okay, so this is from the 2015 census. Okay. This is from the 2010 census, and this is from 2005, and this is from the 2000 census. So as you can see, it's the number of left behind children is kind of growing over time and staying high. Although it's dropped a little bit it dropped a little bit from 20 to 2015. Okay. So the status of these left behind children has been a major point of social and policy concern, as you can imagine, resulting in a good amount of research studying the effect of parental migration on children, mostly children of school age. So this research has been mixed with some studies showing negative effects on schooling and health outcomes, others showing no effect, and still others showing positive effects. So one reason for these mixed outcomes could be how kind of two main forces balance one another in different contexts. So on the one hand, you have when parents migrate, there's an income effect due to remittances they're able to send back home. On the other hand, the lack of parental support may be detrimental. So it could be that the family members who are providing care for kids don't invest as much as parents would, or they may be unable to do so. Okay. So now, despite a good amount of research on school-age kids, there's almost no evidence actually on how parental migration might affect very young children. Presumably, this is due to a lack of adequate data. So we think this is an important research gap for a couple of reasons. The first one is merely the number of kids in this age group who are left behind. So as you can see from the first three columns on this graph over here, which shows the migration status of all children in China as of 2015. So it's hard to read here, but the light gray are this top bar here are other children or non-migrant children. The light, this kind of light beige color are urban left behind children. The dark purple are urban or rural left behind children, the focus of our study. And then the light blue are migrant children. But as you can see from here, the number of children in these first 3 years, so 0 to 2 year olds, so there's a large number of those. So there's about 7.8 million of those in 2015. These are, looking at these bars, you can tell they make up a substantial fraction of all kind of children under 3 in China. So it's actually about 17%. And that number's down from around 12 million or nearly a quarter of all children under the age of 3 in 2010. Okay, so a second reason that we think this is an important research gap is because there's now a large amount of evidence that this stage of life is extremely consequential for effects over the life course. And so how parental migration affects early childhood development could therefore have substantial implications for China's future in a number of dimensions. So in terms of early childhood and the effects of parental migration in this period could differ from older children for a number of reasons. So one reason would be that the income effect may be less important because material needs of younger kids are kind of relatively inexpensive compared to older ones. Second, the effect of parental absence could be more important. So maternal absence in particular has been associated in a number of studies with slower brain development. So that's in the neuroscience literature. There have also been studies mostly in high-income countries looking at the effect of maternal employment in a child's first year of life, which show kind of negative effects on development and later life outcomes. So in this study, our goal is to try to take advantage of a unique 4-wave panel that we've collected following children from 6 to 30 months of age, and use this to try to estimate the causal effect of maternal outmigration on ECD outcomes in China. All right, so here's our data structure. So beginning in 2014, my collaborators and I surveyed a little over 1,800 infants and their caregivers in a random sample of 351 villages in the Qingling Mountain region of southern Shanxi province. So it's kind of in the central part of China. In each village, we enrolled all children between 6 and 12 months of age at baseline. We then returned every 6 months until the cohort was 24 to 32 months old, and each time we collected data on a range of early childhood development, nutrition, and health outcomes, as well as the migration status of the parents. Okay. So we focus on the effect of maternal migration, since this usually represents the largest kind of shift in caregiving practices. So mothers are usually the second to migrate after the fathers, meaning that caregiving usually falls to members of the extended family. So as you can see in this graph, a large number of mothers in our sample, around 20%, outmigrate when the children are between 6 and 30 months of age, leaving them mostly in the care of their grandmother, and that's usually a paternal grandmother. All right, so the primary goal in our paper was to try to estimate the causal effect of maternal migration. Of course, the main concern here is that parental migration decisions might be related to child outcomes in a number of kind of unobserved ways that we can't control for. So to address that concern, we use a difference in difference, or a 2-way fixed effects strategy. Using our 4 waves of data, we regress outcomes on a dummy for whether a child's mom had migrated in the previous period. So that's defined as her being gone for more than 3 months in the previous 6-month period. And we control for a set of time varying covariates and child and survey weight fixed effects. So this approach would give us a causal effect of maternal migration, kind of shown here in the equation as data. So assuming that the trends in child outcomes would have been the same for children with migrating mothers and those without migrating mothers, in the absence of any migration. So in the paper, we show some support for this assumption, given that we don't see any difference in the trends and outcomes between those two groups before mothers actually migrate. Okay, so looking at data before mothers actually leave, the trends are similar. And so to simplify the interpretation of our findings, we've also, our regressions, we also have dropped 245 children whose mothers returned during the period. And because we're looking at a lot of outcomes, we're adjusting for multiple hypotheses using this Romano and Wolf 2005 step-down procedure. All right, so this table shows our main results for the average effect of maternal migration. Each row in the table here shows the estimated effect on a different outcome. Our main finding is this large negative effect on mental development among children. And so this is measured using what's the gold standard for assessing early childhood development outcomes. It's called the Bailey scale of infant development. And so we find a large significant negative effect there on mental development, so an increase in development delay. but we don't see much evidence of negative effects on other outcomes, including psychomotor development, socio-emotional delay, anemia, anthropometrics, or reported illness frequency. Okay, so the negative effects that we find for mental development are mirrored by negative effects on investment. So specifically, caregivers, as you can see in this top panel, were less likely to engage in stimulating activities with the children. So these inputs are known to be important for cognitive growth. In the second panel here, you can see that that although we didn't see any effects on anemia or anthropometrics, we do also find that maternal outmigration has significant negative effects on dietary quality. So reduced diversity and a reduction in iron-rich foods. And finally, we were interested in looking at the effect of or if the effect varied by when mothers decided to outmigrate in relation to the age of the child. So this graph here shows our estimated treatment effects. So each bar here is a separate estimated effect by first when the age of the child. So this is when the outcome was measured, and then when the mother migrated. So as you can see here, we find the largest effects in this earliest stage that we're able to measure. So that's between when the children are 6 to 12 months of age and 12 to 18 months of age. We find effects. So this negative 5.24 effect is about 0.3 standard deviations or so, and that's comparable to some recent home visiting interventions that have been designed to try to improve cognitive outcomes among young children in China. And we also see a kind of a large effect here when children are 24 to 30 months old. And that could be because we're measuring those outcomes during an adjustment phases right after mother's leave, right? Or it could be due to kind of a more general pattern. Okay, so to conclude, we find evidence of large effects on mental development due to maternal migration. So we think this is important given the scale of parental migration in China, with nearly a quarter of 0 to 2-year-olds being left behind in the care of family members as parents migrate to cities for work. We don't see effects on other outcomes, but we do see some evidence of reduced dietary quality. So it's possible those effects on nutrition indicators could show up kind of as children age. And an important note here is that although we don't see a large effect of migration, the outcomes of left behind kids tend to be comparable to other children who are not being left behind. So both groups at 30 months of age in our sample have comparably high rates of delay at those are about 52%. So in terms of policy, we think that our data suggests a need for kind of increased public early childhood investments targeted kind of broadly in rural areas. All right, thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Sean. And now we will have discussant comments on each of the papers that have been presented. So I'd like to call on Sean again to present his 5-minute comments on the first paper that we listened to. This was titled "The Socioeconomic, Cultural, and Demographic Factors of Gap Between Urban and Rural Areas in Terms of Early Childhood Development, and Empirical Evidence from Cameroon Using the Fairly Decomposition Method." Over to you, Sean.
All right, thank you very much. Are you able to see my screen here? Let's see.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, great. All right, so I think Henri's and his co-authors paper make a really interesting contribution to the literature on early childhood development in developing countries, and I'm going to try to put it in a bit of a broader context and to motivate why I think it's really interesting, or has some kind of interesting pieces that I think could be highlighted more. As kind of a lot of us in this section may be aware, there's evidence of kind of high rates of delay in low and middle income countries among younger children. So there's a paper in the Lancet that estimated that about 43% of kids were at risk of developmental delay. Those are children under the age of 5. And we know there's growing evidence of long run effects on life outcomes kind of over the life course. So a whole range of things ranging from health to educational outcomes to wages, et cetera. And so, and the reason for that is, kind of hypothesized to be because of the way skill develops over time in children and into adulthood. And so one point here. So this is kind of a model that was developed by Kunan and Heckman in a series of papers. But what you can see is, is parental investment or any investment in skills kind of have these effects that can build on each other over time, right? So you invest as in children when they're very young and they develop skills, but that allows them to reap more benefits from investment that they get. So better schooling and better other types of inputs as they age. And so that's the hypothesis for why we tend to see these long run effects of early childhood shocks and interventions. And so Henri's paper, I think, makes an interesting contribution because, he's able to look at the role of kind of household versus community level factors where, in a lot of the literature, we've seen a lot on household level investment decisions in kids. And then kind of, we know more about kind of macro level of factors, but here he's one thing he's doing is controlling for or comparing kind of the role of those household level investments and community level factors. And then, again, they find that, parental investments tend to be important, right? So for example, the books that the children have in the household and also kind of whether they're going to any educational programs. And I think that, implies, policies that enable parents to invest better. And fortunately, that's something that we're starting to know more about. So there's a recent review by the Poverty Action Lab at MIT that kind of reviewed 16 randomized trials that have been done relatively recently in a variety of contexts. So these are either kind of home visiting programs or kind of center-based programs that work with parents to try to invest more in kind of the cognitive and socio-emotional development of their kids. And overall, it looks like those tend to be very effective. So in terms of my comments, kind of one thing I thought the paper could do more is sell itself a bit more in terms of kind of what is the motivation for looking at the urban-rural gap in Cameroon. And so one thing that you see, so this graph here is from a paper in PLOS Medicine that was looking at urban or child development measures across a range of countries. And here I've highlighted Cameroon. So you can see that the rate of delay is very high in Cameroon, but also that urban-rural gap is large compared to many other countries. And so I think, providing more, discussion of the context in Cameroon would be important, but also, talking about, the implications for, so Henri mentioned this a bit, but, kind of the implications for longer term growth, and we think that's important because, over time, a lot of productivity gains and economic growth will come from, the rural workforce, moving into urban areas and getting other types of jobs. And so, it's important that workforce have skills. And so that's, one motivation. But I think the larger perspective is that in their paper, they find, basically high rates of children that are not thriving in both urban and rural areas, which is kind of the larger takeaway, I think. I have a few methodological suggestions. So one suggestion would be to try to decompose gaps for each of the individual components. So the paper kind of looked at a global measure, but then if the data are available, looking at individually at reading, numeracy, physical health, socio-emotional, and ability to learn, those 4 components that went into that global index would be interesting. Also, they're using a fairly decomposition because of the dichotomous outcome, but it would also, assuming the data is available, would be possible to construct, these continuous measures using principal components or item response model, something like that, to give you a continuous measure, and then you could use kind of linear methods to decompose as well, and that might give you more power and more information. In the paper, I'd also like to see the underlying regressions. And finally, I think we often, as economists, often call this the Oaxaca blinder decomposition method, but it should be called the Kitagawa decomposition. And so, because it was originally introduced by Evelyn Kitagawa in 1955, which is 18 years before Oaxaca and blinder. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these comments, Sean. I would now like to call on Anvi to present comments on the second paper that we listened to. This was titled The Forgotten Hosts, First and Second Generation Impacts of IDP's Inflow on Childhood Development, Evidence from Burundi. Anvi, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you for the privilege you are giving me to discuss this interesting paper of our dear Swazik. The presenter has assessed the effects of mothers' exposure to IDPs during their childhood or primary school over the first Burundi civil war on the health and socio-emotional development of their offspring born some 2 decades after the IDP inflows. Excuse me. She found that children born 20 years later from mothers who were in their late childhood at the time of the high IDP influx are more likely to be stunting as compared to those who were already adults at that time. She also found that less than 5 years old children born 20 years later from mothers who were in utero at the time at the high IDP influx have better learning ability and are less likely to be violent as compared to those who were already adults at that time. What I really appreciated in this paper is the spatio-temporal character of the analysis conducted by the author. We all know that the importance of time dimension in analysis, such as the estimation of long-run effects of temporary population shocks. The paper is also written in a digestible style that is to be noted. But however, I have noted 2 points, the consideration of which will improve the quality of the paper. Firstly, I found that the choice of the model is not justified enough. In addition to this, it would be interesting to specify the advantages of and the limits of the use of this model. And secondly, regard to the model, I noticed that the author has not specified the different control variables. That's the term X. That those variables have could have an important impact around the time, along the time on the childhood development of the children issued from the mothers who have lived in the IDP period, the peak of period, and this is the main. These are the main points I have noticed concerning the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And finally, I would like to ask Elise to present some comments on the third paper that we listened to, Parental Migration and Early Childhood Development in Rural China. Elise, you have 5 minutes for this.
Thank you, Kechi, for giving me the floor. So I think I really like the paper that Sean presented. So the paper is about looking at the impact of rural-urban migration on children that were left behind in China. I think the motivation was very well presented, considering that up to 25% of all children under the age of 2 in China are left behind as their parents migrate from rural to urban area, seeking for better opportunities. So I think the thing that I really like on the paper is that, first of all, the data that are collected, the unique data, the panel data set that are collected throughout the time make it very unique. Like some people have tried to, estimate such impact, but they didn't have the luxury of having a panel data set to do it. So I think that's helped a lot to correct a lot of endogeneity issue. So I really want to commend the author for that. And also the fact that the empirical strategy is very well taught, like the author is trying different outcome indicators to assess or to proxy a more cognitive development of the children. So this is something that I've also really like on the paper, although I have 2 main comments. I mean, one of the first thing, and I think maybe the author tried that, or maybe I just missed it when I was reading the paper, is to understand, because the impact is fine of maternal migration, but how about fathers? And is there a way, because I mean, I guess the sample size is large enough to also disentangle between the girl child and the boy child to know whether the boy child is less affected or more affected, because there are some evidence in the literature about such a difference, such a gender bias of shocks on children. And I think the second thing that I think I didn't really get is when the author was looking at the mediation analysis, like to unravel the mechanism and only estimating the model by considering the potential mechanism as the outcome. I was just, because there is a way to do it. Usually when you want to test for mechanism, you estimate the main equation, but by controlling what can be the potential mechanism. And if the significance of your treatment variable, which is here the migration, on your outcome is changing when you're controlling for what you expect to be the potential control, which is here whether the children is playing, and dietary diversity outcome indicator, then you should conclude that this is a potential mediator. But I didn't see it. I mean, I haven't seen it done on the paper, so I don't know whether the author can also try that, because then they will be sure that indeed those outcome indicators, even though the migration is having a direct impact on those indicators, they are truly driven the result. They are really the one that are having, like, it's through those channels that the impacts of migration on children cognitive development occur. And another thing that I will add, this is more like of a suggestion for the authors, is they consider the year that the children, like the age of the of the children when the parent migrated, but I think it will also be good that looking at perhaps the age at which the mother has migrated, because I do believe that we might expect some difference if the mother migrated when she's very young as compared to whether she migrated when she's a little bit older, or less. Maybe the variation in terms of age was very low on the sample. Like say the mother that migrated in China are mostly like younger mother, so or maybe older mother, I don't know. So these are just a couple of points that I've raised, and again, I think this is a great paper, and yeah, I look forward to see it published in a very good outlet soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise, for those comments. At this point, I would like to hand over to David Lam from the University of Michigan to moderate the Q&A session with the audience. David, you have the floor.
Okay, great. Well, I really enjoyed all those papers. Presentations were great, comments were great, and in a moment, I'll turn it over to the speakers for to give them a chance to respond to the comments. I have a few questions to add to the mix, and let me give an opportunity to anybody else who wants to ask any questions, and we'll also give the authors an opportunity to interact with each other more in terms of questions. So if anyone else in the all the attendees have been promoted to panelists, as we mentioned. So either use the raise your hand feature or just put something into the chat. So let me just add a few things to the mix from those excellent comments. The main points I had were for Elise and Sean. For Elise, and these questions may well have been made clear if I had read the papers carefully. I skimmed them a bit, and but for Elise, the question I had was you talk about in the presentation and in the paper about the impact of the influx of these displaced persons. And the thing I kept wondering is, and I suspect you can't tell for sure, which is maybe why you're putting it that way, are these women who were children back at the time of the influx, were they themselves displaced persons or children of displaced persons? Or do you think this is really the impact of the influx? In the paper, you sort of keep referring to it as if it's the impact of the influx, but I was a little confused about whether I should be thinking about this as the impact of having a parent who was a displaced person as a child, or having a parent who was a child living in a place that had a bunch of other displaced people. So that I'd just be interested in your comments about that. And for Sean, I was this is related a bit to Elise's points. I kept wondering, like, who's taking care of these children when the mother is gone. You showed some things at the beginning about the proportion living with grandparents or living with some other parent. But I assume most of these children are living with a grandparent, probably a grandmother on one side, or the other, possibly the mother's mother. And I just wondered, does that matter? Do you have evidence on that? But given that you seem to show these mechanisms of the children aren't being played with as much, they're not being sung to as much, important developmental issues, it's like, well, who is taking care of them? Is it that Granny just doesn't sing to the grandchildren in the same way that mothers do? Is it a generational thing? A little bit related to the age issue that Elise raised about how old are the mothers, how old are the caretakers? Does it matter whether the father is around? How often is the father around? Just some questions related to that. I'm sure there are things that you've probably thought about quite a bit. So let me let me give the authors a chance to respond in the same order that the paper is presented. So starting with Henri.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Sean Sylvia for his comments. And I have noted one main question concerning the different components of the childhood development. But it is possible, yes, it's possible to conduct the study considering each component of the development. And I think that it would be the objective of my next paper. Thank you.
Okay, great. Elise, you have some responses?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David, and thank you, Henry, for your very relevant question. So I will start with David's question, which is more general about which type of, like whether the models were IDP themselves. Actually, no. The IDP inflow is the shock that I look at, and basically those models that I consider, I mean, which were children or already adolescent or adult at the time of the influx, are the one that I look at. So I'm looking at whether the mother were living in an area that received a high influx of IDPs, which is then my shock, my temporal shock. And I basically see, look at the impact of that shock, which is the inflow of IDP in some area, looking at the variation. Some area receive a lot of IDP, other area receive less IDPs on the children that they gave birth to years later. So
yes, just to clarify, no, I understand that. My point was, if they were living in an area where there's an influx of IDPs, they might have been IDPs themselves or children of IDPs. And can you tell, were they people who were already there, or were they themselves part of the IDP community? That was my question.
Oh yeah, so to respond to that question, actually I focused my sample on people that said they've always lived there, like they have never migrated. So then, because I can't tell, so to avoid that noise, I excluded in the sample the people that have never been there, because I have a question on migration and I know exactly how long the mother were living in those areas. Yeah, so that's what I did. And I can follow up quickly with the question of Henry. That were a very good suggestion. Actually, perhaps in the presentation or in the paper, I haven't extended a lot, especially even when I was presenting, but I did have control variable. Since my level of observation is the children, so I control for the gender of the child, where the child is living as of today, and also the type of material that they have at the household. This might as well influence children health or learning ability, apart from the fact that their mother were actually living in a high or low risk IDP receiving area. And I will make sure to maybe extend it a little bit more on the paper. It's still a very first draft, and yeah, thank you for the suggestion. I don't think I've missed any other comments here. Yeah.
Okay, great. And Sean?
All right, thank you, Elise and David, for those comments. So on kind of whether fathers are around, we've been asked that a few times. So one challenge there is that there's not a lot of change over time. So a lot of the dads, kind of leave and go back to the city to work shortly after the child's born. So we don't have a lot of variation there to look at. But my guess, based on kind of studies for older kids, is that there's kind of a larger income effect when the dads leave, right? And the moms are still home with the kids. And so there's probably more of a positive effect when the mom's home and the dad leaves, because you have the income effect, but mom's still there. But then when mom leaves, that caregiving does shift to usually the paternal grandparents, right? And you know, there we've talked to a lot of parents and grandparents about caregiving practices, and they're, you know, it's pretty amazing. You know, China's developed so fast that there's this huge gap, the generational gap in kind of their attitudes towards caregiving, right? So you ask a grandmother in rural areas, you know, kind of, do you sing to the kid? And they think it's an odd thing to do, right? Why would you sing to the kid? They can't understand it. Whereas moms, you know, think that's, you know, completely normal. And so the grandparents are kind of not doing as much of that type of investment.
I just interject that we see exactly the same thing in South Africa. There it's usually the maternal grandmother, but this generational difference in getting on the floor and playing with children and reading with children, singing with children, it is a really interesting. So I think that's kind of a universal thing. It's super interesting. Yeah. Right, and part of that's because it's developed so fast, right? That you have, you know, just, you know, big gap in kind of access to information and attitudes, and so that's one thing. Male versus female, we actually don't see much of a difference between kind of impacts on boys and girls in the sample, at least. So you know, there's, you know, a little bit, but we don't see any significant difference there. On the mediation analysis, that's really good. A really good suggestion. We didn't do that initially because we just didn't have a good way to causally identify the mediation. And so, you know, we could do that though to try to dig into more of the mechanisms. So I think that would be good kind of suggestive evidence. You know, on the age of the mother, it's yeah, most of the moms are young 20s. When, you know, a lot of them have been in the city working, and they come back, and then a lot of them kind of go back to the city. So that's generally what's happening. They're all, you know, 23, 24, 25. So there's not a lot of variation in the mother's age there. So, but that's it. Thank you. There's probably also not much variation in presence of other siblings. There probably right, usually aren't other siblings. Yeah, in this sample, there's I think, you know, 2-3% of our sample has a sibling at this point. So interesting. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks for all that those good comments and the response to the comments, and I'll throw it back to Nkechi.
Thank you very much, David. And I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance and your very useful contributions. This brings us to the end of the session and the conference. And with the exception of the Meet the Author session that is scheduled right after this, there'll be no more plenary and parallel sessions. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the IUSSP for the impressive organization of this conference. It has been a great success, and we have listened to many amazing papers and had a lot of rich and informative interactions between researchers, attendees. We'd like to let you know that the 2021 IUSSP International Population Conference will be held in December 2021 in Hyderabad. The call for papers will go out on May the 15th, 2021. So we hope that you'll be able to submit your papers when the call goes out. At this point, I would like to wish everyone happy holidays. And for those of you who can, we look forward to meeting you in the Meet the Author session immediately after this. Thank you again, and the session is now closed.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.